Next, I'd like to talk about sociolinguistic competence. That is, adjusting how we speak to the person and the situation. In linguistics, we refer to this as register. So, for example, I would speak differently to a coworker than I would perhaps to my boss, than I might to a spouse, or to a close friend, or to a child, or to a dog. We speak differently based on our relationship with the person. So let's look at a few examples of this culturally, and then you can apply this to your own speech. For example, in America, we often say, "you guys." Now, you'll notice with the expression, "you guys," how informal it is. You wouldn't want to use this in a very formal situation. You also might not want to use it with respected elders, where you would say something more formal, like "ladies and gentlemen," or "all of you." "You guys" is extremely informal and used with people of your own age group, and usually used with younger individuals, 30 or younger in general, to be safe. You also want to be careful overusing sir and ma'am. Some cultures use those much more often, or to call someone Mr. or Mrs. or Ms. and their first name, like Mrs. Sarah, Miss Sarah, or Mr. Bob. We refer to people generally by their first name, and we don't need to ask them for permission. You might say, "Is Mr. Smith home?" And then if you're speaking to Mr. Smith and he starts talking to you, you could say, "Now, Bob, let me share something with you." People will typically not be offended. If you mispronounce their name or they go by a different name and they take the time to correct you, "My name's not Bob, I go by Robert," then you'll want to remember and use the new name correctly. But certainly overusing sir and ma'am can seem too formal in an informal situation, like a phone conversation. Another example is what I call ingratiating language. That's when you're too polite. You're overdoing it. For example, "Thank you so very much for talking to me today." On the phone, "Thanks for your time" is sufficient. You might want to use that kind of language in a very formal situation. "Thank you so much for inviting me this evening." This is a formal situation. A response to "How are you?" "Wonderful, it's so great to talk to you." To a friend, perhaps. On the phone, "How are you?" "Fine, thanks, and yourself?" Good enough. "I'm good," "I'm great," whatever it might be. Nice, short, to the point. Some people say, "I'm okay, thanks for asking," "I'm doing great, thanks," but certainly not, "I'm doing so fabulously well and wonderful, thank you so much for taking the time to ask." Much too overdone. Other elements to think about are age, generation, and gender. Different people speak differently. Let me give you a few examples. "Oh my goodness me." This is something that your grandmother would use, not something that people in their 20s and 30s say much. "Thank you so much" is for women, not men. Men tend to say things like "thank you very much," not "thank you so much." "You betcha" is used more often by men than women. It's okay for women to use it. And we use this not to mean we're betting money, but we just say, "I agree with you," "I gotcha," "I betcha." These are just ways to say, "I will do it." "Will you tell your friend to call me tomorrow?" "You betcha I will." It means I'm agreeing with you. Now, you want to be careful with dated expressions, like the expression "groovy." This was used in the 1960s. It's not common today unless you're being really silly. If someone asks you if you want to do something, you go "groovy," it's going to sound really dated. So probably not something you want to use. Instead, you can say, "Wow, that's really interesting." Wow is still pretty okay. You might check with your teenagers to know for sure. People often use expressions like "cool" and "neat," and you don't have to use these expressions, but you want to use ones that aren't outdated. That is, expressions that have been used in the last few years and are commonly used today. Trite expressions are ones that are overused. Expressions like "a bird in the hand," "an ounce of prevention." We all know the second half. "An ounce of prevention, worth a pound of cure." "A bird in the hand, worth two in the bush." These are cliches, they're overused, and they don't add much to your speech. The other thing you want to be careful about is expressions that are common in one country and not in another. I've heard people say to me, "Does this suit you?" or "What suits you?" It's very formal and foreign sounding to an American. We tend to use the expression, "Does that work for you?" "What works for you?" "Does this work for you?" "That works for me." Much more common than "Does that suit you?" And lastly, let's meet at 2 p.m. according to the Eastern Standard. We usually say, "Let's meet at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time." You can always write EST or say EST, but we would say Eastern Standard Time, not according to the Eastern Standard, which sounds stilted and uncomfortable. If you're not sure, the best way to learn is to listen to others. If you're not sure what the intent is, record it, ask someone. Become really familiar with an expression before you begin to use it, and perhaps use it incorrectly and insult someone. You're always better off to use less colorful or less creative expressions in favor of more common expressions. It's much better to speak in a way that's a bit repetitive or a bit simplistic than to offend someone by trying to use an expression where you're unsure of the connotation. The connotation is that underlying meaning that may not be totally obvious to you or to them, and it's an expression that you want to learn the complete and full usefulness of before you attempt to use the expression. Be really careful with idioms and cliches, but certainly feel free to use them as you begin to understand them. This whole section is sociolinguistic competence, and I look forward to speaking to you in the next video on the third component of communicative competence.